Has your child's unique hobby ever saved someone's life? When you're a parent of an autistic child, you learn to embrace their obsessions. For my 10-year-old son, it was nunchucks, not video games, dinosaurs, or trains. Nunchucks. He practiced 4 hours every day in our garage, the same moves over and over until his hands calloused. Other dads were teaching their kids baseball. I was watching my kid spin deadly weapons around like a mini Bruce Lee. Honestly, I thought it was incredible. His teachers kept suggesting we redirect his energy into something more appropriate, but I always defended him. If it made him happy, then it was good for me. I just never thought his obsession would save multiple lives. My son had a girlfriend at school. I say girlfriend in quotes because they're 10, so it's not a real relationship. But they were both autistic and understood each other in a way other kids didn't. They'd hold hands at recess, share their snacks, sit together at lunch. It was innocent and sweet, and my wife and I thought it was harmless. But then this 13-year-old kid from the older class started hitting on her. My son told me the kid kept following her around, asking her to be his girlfriend, getting angry when she said no. She rejected him over and over, but he wouldn't stop. That's when the bullying started. One day after school, the 13-year-old cornered her alone by the concrete stairs. My son wasn't there to help her, and the kid pushed her down. She fell hard. When my son found her, she was crying with a black eye, split lip, and a sprained wrist. She was too terrified to tell the teachers who did it because he'd threatened her with a knife if she tattled. But she told my son everything. He said he'll keep hurting me until I like him. That's when my son looked at her injured face and said, completely serious, "That meanie panini is never going to hurt you again. I'll make sure of it." She was crying and asked, "How?" My son smiled at her. "I have my nunchucks, the transformer ones you gave me for Christmas." She looked shocked, "But he's bigger and older." "You'd really fight him for me?" My son said, "You're my girlfriend. I would fight a dinosaur for you, and he's not bigger than a dinosaur." From that day on, my son started carrying his nunchucks everywhere. He even secretly brought them to school in case he needed them there. At home, he upped his training, now doing 6 hours per day instead of 4, watching every nunchuck video on the internet. He got so good he could use the nunchucks to pass you a glass of water from across the table without spilling it. During this time, my son's girlfriend's parents reported the bullying to the school with photos of her injuries. In response, the principal gave the bully a 1-day suspension. 1 day. That's how we found out the system doesn't do much when the bully's parents donate to the school. After the suspension, the bully came back angrier. His threats started. He'd text my son saying, "I know where you live," with a photo of our house. He brought a BB gun into school and threatened the girlfriend with it. He left notes in her backpack ranging from deranged love letters to intimate descriptions about how he'd take her by force if he had to. Then Friday happened. My son and his girlfriend were over at our house, and my wife and I wanted to run to the corner store to surprise them with snacks. We left them playing video games and told them we'd be back in 15 minutes. We didn't even think anything would happen, but the second we walked away, our bathroom window shattered. The 13-year-old bully climbed through the broken window holding his dad's gun. He wasn't just breaking in, he was hunting. My son heard it first. His girlfriend screamed, and he told her to run straight to the bedroom and lock the door behind her, then call for help. "Where's your little girlfriend?" the bully called out from the bathroom. My son grabbed his transformer nunchucks from the living room and positioned himself in the hallway between the intruder and the bedroom where his girlfriend was hiding. The 13-year-old came around the corner, a real loaded pistol in his hand, but my son was already waiting there. The second the bully came in view, he started raising his firearm at my son, but my son didn't hesitate. He didn't freeze or go cold. By the time that gun started coming up, my son's nunchucks were already moving. One perfect strike knocked the gun out of the kid's hand. The bully lunged at him in rage, but my son had already shifted into muscle memory. He started whooping him with the nunchucks, body shots, leg strikes, head shots, all precise, all controlled. The 13-year-old dropped hard onto our floor, nose bleeding. My son stood over him, the bedroom door unlocked. His girlfriend came out and saw him, her bruise still visible on her face from when the bully had hurt her. She ran to him. "You kept your promise." That's when my son finally broke from his focused state. He started shaking as the adrenaline hit him. He looked down and saw the bully was reaching for the gun. That's the exact moment my wife and I burst through our door, accompanied by the bully's parents, who'd gone out looking for their child. The gun was still on the floor between us. I moved faster than I thought possible and grabbed it before anyone else could reach it, my hands shaking as I secured the weapon and stepped back. My wife already had her phone out calling 911, her voice steady despite the chaos as she reported a home invasion and an injured intruder. The bully's parents stood frozen in our doorway, staring at their son bleeding on our hallway floor, his nose clearly broken and his face swelling from where my son's nunchucks had connected. My son still held the transformer nunchucks in his hands, standing over the bully like a guard, but his whole body was trembling now that the adrenaline was wearing off. His girlfriend clung to my wife's side, her face showing the fading bruise from when this same boy had pushed her down the concrete stairs weeks ago. The bully's mother started crying and tried to rush forward, but I held up my hand and told everyone to stay back until the police arrived. Officer Grayson Ainsworth showed up within 4 minutes, 2 other patrol cars right behind him, and I handed over the gun immediately while explaining that this 13-year-old had broken through our bathroom window to hurt my son's girlfriend. The paramedics rushed in next and started treating the bully's injuries while my son finally dropped his nunchucks and started crying, the reality of what just happened hitting him all at once. My wife wrapped our son in her arms while his girlfriend pressed against both of them, and I watched the officers photograph everything: the broken bathroom window, the dropped gun, the nunchucks that had saved 2 children's lives. The bully's father kept trying to get to his son, but the officers made everyone stay in different areas while they secured the scene and took initial statements. Detective Nina Bowles arrived about 20 minutes later and immediately started separating everyone for proper interviews, beginning with me and my wife in our kitchen, while a female officer stayed with both children in the bedroom. I explained the entire history, how the bully had been stalking my son's girlfriend for weeks, how he'd already hurt her badly enough to leave visible injuries, how the school had only given him a 1-day suspension despite photographic evidence, how his threats had escalated to texting photos of our house. The detective's face got darker as I showed her the threatening messages on my son's phone, including the picture of our home that the bully had sent days earlier with the text saying he knew where we lived. She photographed everything on her own phone and asked why we hadn't reported the threats to police before tonight, and I had to admit we'd trusted the school to handle it after the girlfriend's parents made their official report to the principal. The paramedics loaded the bully onto a stretcher and transported him to the hospital with a police escort. His injuries, including what looked like a broken nose, possible head injury, and multiple marks from the nunchuck strikes all over his body. His parents followed in their car after giving brief statements, the mother still crying, and the father looking completely shocked at what their son had done. Detective Bowles spent over an hour interviewing my son with my wife present and a specialist on video call, using gentle questions to understand exactly what happened from his perspective. My son explained in his straightforward way how he heard the window break, told his girlfriend to hide in the bedroom and call for help, then positioned himself in the hallway because he'd promised to protect her. When the detective asked how he knew what to do with the nunchucks, my son described his 6-hour daily training routine and demonstrated the exact disarming strike he'd used on the intruder. His hands started shaking again during the demonstration, and he suddenly asked if he was in trouble for hurting someone, his voice small and scared in a way I'd never heard from him before. The girlfriend gave her statement next, describing how she locked herself in the bedroom like my son told her to and called 911, hearing the fight in the hallway and being scared that the bully would hurt her boyfriend. She kept touching the fading bruise on her face from the stairs incident weeks ago, telling the detective that my son had saved her life tonight. The interviews dragged on past midnight before Detective Bowles finally sat down with us in the living room and explained what would happen next. She told us the bully would face serious charges in juvenile court, including home invasion, assault with a deadly weapon, and stalking, based on the evidence and his age being old enough to understand his actions. She made it clear that my son had acted in self-defense and defense of another person, that no charges would be filed against him, but that there would be follow-up investigations and more interviews over the coming days as they built their case. Then the detective showed us something that made my stomach turn. Officers had searched the bully's phone at the hospital and found detailed plans about tonight's attack, including a hand-drawn layout of our house showing which windows faced which rooms and where he planned to enter. He'd been watching our home for at least a week, taking photos from different angles, documenting our routines, waiting for the right opportunity when my son and his girlfriend would be alone and easy targets. The detective scrolled through dozens of surveillance photos on her tablet, pictures of our house from across the street, close-ups of our windows, shots of my son and his girlfriend playing in our yard. The planning was detailed and disturbing, showing this wasn't some impulsive act, but a calculated attack by someone who'd been studying us for days. We finally got both children into bed around 2 in the morning, exhausted and traumatized, but physically safe. I thought they'd sleep through from pure exhaustion, but an hour later my son started screaming. I ran to his room and found him sitting up in bed, crying and shaking, saying he kept seeing the bully's face when the nunchucks hit him. My wife and I took turns sitting with him the rest of the night, one of us always in the chair next to his bed while he tried to sleep. Every time he'd start to drift off, he'd jerk awake again, and I realized that winning the physical fight didn't mean my son had escaped without harm from this whole thing. The next morning, I found my son standing in the hallway staring at his nunchucks where the police had photographed them and left them on the floor. He wouldn't go near them or touch them, just stood there looking at them like they'd turned into something dangerous and scary. When I reached down to pick them up and move them back to the garage where he usually kept them, he asked me in a quiet voice to put them somewhere he couldn't see them anymore. I carried them to the basement storage room and closed the door, understanding that the weapon that had saved his life had also forced him to hurt another person, and his 10-year-old brain was struggling to process that. The girlfriend's parents showed up mid-morning, looking exhausted after spending the whole night at the hospital with their daughter for tests due to the extreme stress of everything that happened. They hugged us and thanked us through tears for keeping their daughter safe, but I could see the fear in their eyes as they looked at our broken bathroom window, now covered with plywood, and the police tape still marking sections of our hallway. Their daughter was physically fine, but emotionally shaken, and they'd kept her overnight just to be safe. Detective Bowles called around noon to update us on the situation. The bully was being held in juvenile detention pending a court hearing, unable to post bail due to the severity of the charges and the threat he posed. She also mentioned that his father's gun had not been properly secured in their home, which would add potential criminal charges against the parents for failing to safely store a firearm. Then she told us we needed to bring our son in for a formal video-recorded interview that afternoon at the police station's special interview room designed for children. At the police station, my son sat in a room decorated with toys and soft furniture, nothing like the cold interrogation rooms you see on TV. Detective Bowles asked him to tell the story again, while a camera recorded everything for the court case. He was calmer today, more controlled in how he described what happened, but he kept asking if the bully could come back to our house. The detective patiently explained multiple times that the boy was locked up in a secure facility and couldn't hurt anyone right now, but my son needed to hear it over and over before he seemed to believe it. After the interview finished, a social worker met with us in a different room to discuss resources for dealing with what both children had experienced. She explained that they would both need therapy to process the trauma, emphasizing that even though my son was the one who defended them, he still went through a situation where someone threatened his life, and he had to use violence for the first time. She said this could be deeply confusing for any child, but especially for one on the autism spectrum who might process the moral complexity of hurting someone in self-defense differently than other kids. We scheduled an emergency appointment with a therapist who worked with childhood trauma and autism, getting a slot for tomorrow morning because the social worker marked our case as urgent priority. My son spent the rest of the day unusually quiet, not playing with any of his toys or wanting to watch his favorite shows, just sitting close to either my wife or me on the couch. He didn't want to talk about what happened, didn't want to do anything really, just needed to be near us. That evening, the school principal called my cell phone. She said she was concerned and wanted to know when my son would be returning to class, completely ignoring the fact that her totally inadequate response to the initial bullying had directly led to this whole situation getting worse. I told her my son wouldn't be back until I was convinced the school could actually protect him and that we'd be having a serious discussion about their failure to act appropriately, despite having photographic evidence of assault and multiple reports about ongoing threats. The girlfriend's parents called around 9 that night. I answered on the second ring, and her mom's voice came through tight and scared, telling me they'd been discussing their daughter's safety all evening and couldn't see how they could trust this school anymore. She said they were looking at other districts, maybe even moving to a different town where the administration actually protected kids instead of protecting donation checks. I felt my stomach drop because I knew what that would mean for my son. He was sitting on the couch nearby, supposedly watching TV, but his eyes locked onto me the second he heard me say her name. I tried to keep my voice neutral, tried to walk into another room, but he followed me, his face already showing that panicked look he gets when his routine gets disrupted. After I hung up, he grabbed my arm and asked if his girlfriend was leaving. I couldn't lie to him, so I explained that her parents were scared and thinking about other schools. He started crying immediately, not the loud crying, but the quiet kind that breaks your heart worse, tears running down his face while he rocked back and forth on his heels. He kept saying she was the only one who understood him, the only friend who didn't think he was weird, and what would he do without her at the school. My wife came in and tried to comfort him, but he pulled away and went to his room, shutting the door quietly behind him. We heard him crying in there for over an hour. The first therapy session happened the next morning at a clinic across town. The therapist's office had soft lighting and comfortable chairs, toys in one corner and art supplies on a low table. My son sat stiff in his chair, hands folded in his lap, answering questions in 1 or 2 word responses. The therapist asked him to describe what happened during the break-in, and he recited the facts like he was reading from a script, no emotion in his voice at all. But then she asked him how he felt about hitting the bully with the nunchucks, and his whole face changed. He looked down at his hands and said he felt proud because he saved his girlfriend, but then his voice got quieter, and he said he also felt bad because he made someone bleed, and that's not what good people do. The therapist pulled out a set of cards with different emotions drawn on them, cartoon faces showing happy, sad, angry, scared, confused. She asked him to pick the ones that matched his feelings, and he picked 5 cards, holding them up one by one, while his hands shook slightly. She explained that feeling 2 opposite things at the same time was normal, that protecting someone you care about is good, even when it requires doing something hard. She used simple words and concrete examples, showing him pictures of superheroes who had to fight bad guys to save people, asking if those heroes were bad for fighting. My son thought about it for a long time, then said he guessed they weren't bad, but they probably felt sad about hurting people even when they had to. The therapist smiled and told him that was very wise, that understanding that complexity made him mature beyond his years. Detective Bowles called my cell phone that afternoon while we were driving home from therapy. She said the district attorney's office had reviewed all the evidence and witness statements, and they were treating this case with maximum seriousness. The bully would be charged as a juvenile, but given his age and the premeditated nature of the attack, they were pushing for placement in a juvenile detention facility instead of just probation. She explained that the kid had planned this for at least a week, had stolen his father's gun, had broken into our home with clear intent to harm or kill, and that level of calculation showed he was dangerous. The DA's office was also considering charges against the bully's parents for failing to secure their firearm properly, since that failure directly enabled their son to commit these crimes. Detective Bowles said we'd need to come in for another interview next week, this time with the prosecutor present, so they could prepare for the preliminary hearing. She assured me they had a strong case and that both children would be protected throughout the legal process. 3 days after the incident, a thick envelope arrived in our mailbox. Inside was a letter on expensive letterhead from an attorney representing the bully's parents. The letter requested a meeting to discuss a resolution that would be in everyone's best interests, suggesting that continued legal action would be traumatic for all the children involved, and that perhaps we could find a way to handle this privately. I read it twice, my anger building with each sentence, because I could see exactly what they were doing. They wanted to minimize their son's consequences and their own liability, wanted to sweep this under the rug like they'd probably swept away every other problem their money could fix. I called a family attorney that same afternoon, someone a friend had recommended who specialized in cases involving children and schools. The attorney listened to my summary of events, asked to see all our documentation, then told me firmly to decline any direct contact with the bully's family or their representatives. He said the criminal case needed to proceed without interference, and that any civil matters could be addressed later once the criminal proceedings were complete. He also said he'd send a letter to their attorney making it clear we would not be participating in any private negotiations. My son's nightmares continued every single night that week. He'd wake up screaming around 2 or 3 in the morning, and either my wife or I would rush to his room to find him sitting up in bed, sweating and shaking. He kept dreaming about the bully's face, about the gun, about not being fast enough with his nunchucks. During the day, he refused to go near any windows in our house, keeping himself in the center of rooms and flinching whenever he heard glass clink or a door slam. The bathroom where the break-in happened became completely off-limits. He'd walk past it quickly with his eyes down, and if he needed to use a bathroom, he'd go upstairs to the one in our bedroom, even though it was further away. At his next therapy session, the therapist explained this was a normal trauma response, that his brain was trying to keep him safe by avoiding anything associated with the danger he'd experienced. She said it would take time to work through, that we shouldn't push him to face these fears too quickly, but that we should maintain his other routines to give him a sense of stability and control. She recommended we be patient with his heightened anxiety and let him move at his own pace toward feeling safe again. The school superintendent called 4 days after the incident, her voice professionally concerned as she asked to schedule a meeting to discuss the situation and how the school could support our family. I told her I'd bring our attorney, and there was a pause on her end before she agreed that would be fine. The meeting happened 2 days later in the superintendent's office, a large room with certificates on the walls and a big wooden desk that she sat behind like a barrier. Our attorney sat next to me with a thick folder of documents, and the superintendent's defensive tone started the second she began speaking. She talked about how seriously the school took student safety, how they'd followed all their protocols in responding to the initial bullying reports, how they couldn't have predicted this escalation. I felt my jaw clench as she spoke, and I glanced at our attorney, who gave me a small nod to let him handle it. Our attorney opened his folder and pulled out a timeline he'd prepared, laying it on the superintendent's desk. He walked her through every single report made about the bully, starting with the girlfriend's parents bringing in photos of their daughter's injuries. He showed the principal's response, a one-day suspension for causing a black eye, split lip, and sprained wrist. He continued through the subsequent reports about threats, the BB gun incident at the school, the disturbing notes left in the girlfriend's backpack, and the photo of our house that the bully had sent. For each incident, he showed the school's response or lack thereof, the pattern becoming undeniable as he laid it out. Then he pulled out the donation records, public information showing the substantial contributions the bully's parents had made to the school over the past 3 years. He didn't accuse anyone directly, just let the timeline speak for itself, showing how a dangerous student had been protected while his victims were left vulnerable. The superintendent's face went pale as she realized we'd documented everything, that we had proof of their failures, and that the school district faced serious legal exposure for their negligence. She started talking about reviewing their policies, about implementing new safety measures, but our attorney cut her off and said those conversations could happen later, that right now, we needed immediate action to ensure our son's safety when he returned to the school. My son went back to the school exactly 1 week after the incident, but not without conditions. The district assigned an aide specifically to watch him and his girlfriend throughout the school day, someone who would stay within sight of them at all times. They implemented a safety plan that included immediate removal and police contact for any student who threatened either child, no questions asked, no warnings given. The principal had to sign off on all of it, and when I dropped my son off that first morning back, she couldn't meet my eyes, just nodded, and said she'd personally ensure the plan was followed. I looked her in the eye and told her I'd be checking in every single day, that I'd be showing up unannounced to verify the aide was doing her job, and that if anything happened to my son or his girlfriend, the school district would face consequences they couldn't buy their way out of. My son held my hand tight as we walked into the building, his other hand clutching his backpack straps, and I could feel him trembling slightly as we approached his classroom. The girlfriend's parents called me later that morning. They'd decided to keep their daughter at the school after seeing the new safety measures in action, after meeting the aide who seemed genuinely committed to protecting both children, and after our attorney had made it clear that the school district knew they were being watched closely. When my son's girlfriend walked into class that day, I watched through the classroom window as my son's whole body relaxed, his shoulders dropping from up near his ears down to their normal position, his face breaking into the first real smile I'd seen from him in over a week. During recess, they held hands like they always had, walking around the playground together while the aide followed at a respectful distance, close enough to intervene, but far enough to let them feel some normalcy. But that aide's presence was a constant reminder that their innocent friendship had been stolen, that they couldn't just be two kids who liked each other anymore, that they were now victims who needed protection. 2 weeks after the home invasion, my wife and I sat in a courtroom for the preliminary hearing. We'd left our son at home with my sister, not wanting him anywhere near the courthouse where the bully would be. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense expression, reviewed the evidence that the prosecutor presented. She looked at the photos of our broken bathroom window, examined the police reports documenting the gun and the injuries the bully sustained during my son's defense, read through the threatening texts and the disturbing notes. The bully sat at a table with his attorney and his parents, his head down, wearing a dress shirt that looked too formal for a 13-year-old. The judge asked several questions about the timeline, about the school's response to initial reports, about how the bully had obtained his father's gun. After an hour of testimony and evidence review, she determined there was more than sufficient cause to proceed with juvenile charges for home invasion, assault with a deadly weapon, stalking, and attempted assault. The bully's attorney tried to argue for release to his parents' custody pending trial, but the judge denied it immediately, ordering him to remain in juvenile detention due to the severity of the crimes and the clear danger he posed. As we left the courthouse, I felt my wife squeeze my hand tight, and I knew we were both thinking the same thing, that this was just the beginning of a long legal process, but at least the system was finally taking this seriously. The next hearing happened 3 weeks later, and we sat in the same courtroom while the bully's attorney stood up and started his argument. He talked about his client's troubled mental state, about how the kid needed treatment instead of detention, about how locking him up wouldn't address the underlying issues. I felt my jaw clench as he described the bully as a victim of his own brain chemistry, as someone who deserved compassion and therapy rather than punishment. My wife grabbed my hand under the table because she could feel how angry I was getting. This lawyer was standing there trying to excuse stalking, breaking into our home and pointing a loaded gun at my 10-year-old son by saying his client had mental health problems. The judge listened to the whole presentation, her face showing nothing, then asked the attorney if mental health issues excused breaking into someone's home with a deadly weapon. The attorney stumbled through his response, saying no, but that treatment should be prioritized. The judge ordered a full psychiatric evaluation, but made it clear the bully would stay in juvenile detention pending trial because the crimes were too serious to ignore. She said something about taking the severity seriously and protecting the community, and I felt my wife's grip on my hand relax slightly. We left that courthouse feeling like at least one adult in the system understood that what happened to our son wasn't something you could therapy away without consequences. 2 days after that hearing, our attorney called and asked us to come to his office for an update. We sat across from him in his conference room while he explained that the school district's insurance company had reached out about settling potential civil claims. He said they wouldn't have contacted him unless they knew they'd failed badly in their duty to protect students. The insurance company wanted to avoid a lawsuit that would expose every mistake the school made, every time they chose donations over safety, every warning sign they ignored. Our attorney asked what we wanted to do, and I told him we weren't interested in money. My wife agreed immediately. What we wanted was real policy changes that might stop another family from going through what we went through. We wanted mandatory procedures that couldn't be ignored just because some parent wrote a check to the school. Our attorney nodded and said he'd communicate that to them, that we'd consider a settlement only if it included forcing the district to implement specific safety reforms. He warned us that might take longer than just accepting money, but we didn't care about longer. We cared about other kids being safe. My son's weekly therapy sessions started showing us how much he was struggling inside. The therapist called us in after his 3rd session and explained that he felt guilty about hurting the bully, even though he understood he had no choice. She said his autistic brain processed the moral situation very literally, that he knew hitting people were wrong, but also knew protecting his girlfriend was right, and those two facts were crashing into each other in his head. He kept asking the therapist if he was a bad person for making someone bleed, if protecting yourself counted as being mean, if the bully's parents were sad because of what he did. The therapist was working on helping him understand that sometimes right and wrong aren't simple, that protecting himself and his girlfriend was the right choice, even though causing injury felt wrong to him. She said it might take months for him to fully process this. That moral confusion after using violence in self-defense was normal even for adults, and that his literal thinking patterns made it harder for him to accept the gray areas. We watched our son struggle with this every day, saw him stare at his hands sometimes like he was still seeing the nunchucks in them. A month after the home invasion, my son walked into the garage where I was organizing tools and asked if he could see his nunchucks. I'd moved them to a high shelf after the incident because he'd asked me to put them somewhere he couldn't see them. I got them down and handed them to him, watching as he held them like they might suddenly turn into snakes. He took them outside to our driveway and started doing some basic moves, the simple patterns he'd learned first when he was younger. His form was still perfect, muscle memory taking over, but I could see his heart wasn't in it. After maybe 5 minutes, he stopped, walked back to me, and handed them over without saying anything. The joy that used to light up his whole face during practice was completely gone. He went back inside, and I stood there holding the Transformer nunchucks, understanding that the incident had stolen something from him that we might never get back. The girlfriend started having her own problems at the school. Her parents called us one evening to explain that their daughter was developing separation anxiety and having panic attacks when my son wasn't nearby. The school counselor had noticed her becoming distressed during classes when my son was in different rooms, and she'd had 2 full panic attacks in the cafeteria when she couldn't immediately see where he was. Her therapist explained to both our families that this was her trauma response to nearly losing her protector, that her brain had learned my son kept her safe and now couldn't handle him being out of sight. The 4 of us parents coordinated closely on how to help both children feel safe while encouraging them to gradually build independence again. We set up check-in times during the school day, worked with teachers to arrange some shared activities, and had both therapists communicate about treatment approaches. It was complicated and exhausting, but these were our kids, and they needed us to figure it out together. Detective Bowles called me 5 weeks after the home invasion with an update about the psychiatric evaluation. She said the evaluation revealed concerning findings about the bully, including obsessive tendencies and a serious lack of empathy that supported the prosecution's argument that he posed genuine danger. The psychologist who evaluated him found patterns of fixation and inability to understand how his actions affected other people. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. Detective Bowles also told me that the evaluation uncovered something else, that the bully's parents had ignored multiple warning signs over the years and failed to get him appropriate help despite recommendations from his previous schools. She said this information strengthened the case significantly because it showed a pattern of dangerous behavior that his parents had enabled by refusing to address it. I asked if this meant he'd definitely be convicted, and she said nothing was guaranteed, but the evidence was very strong. 6 weeks after that night, the school board held a public meeting to address safety policies. The auditorium was packed with parents who'd heard about what happened and wanted answers about how the bully had been allowed to terrorize students for so long. My wife and I sat in the front row with the girlfriend's parents. When they opened the floor for public comment, I stood up and walked to the microphone. I testified about the complete timeline of failures, starting with the girlfriend being pushed down the stairs and showing up at the school with visible injuries. I described how the principal gave the bully 1 day of suspension despite photographic evidence of assault. I explained the escalating threats, the BB gun incident at the school, the disturbing notes in her backpack. I told them about the text message with a photo of our house and how school administrators knew about all of this, but did nothing effective to stop it. Then the girlfriend's father stood up and presented the photos of his daughter's injuries that the school had seen weeks before the home invasion. He held up each photo so the whole auditorium could see the black eye, the split lip, the bruised wrist, asking the board how they could look at these pictures and think a 1-day suspension was appropriate. Other parents spoke too, sharing their own stories of bullying incidents that got inadequate responses, creating a picture of systematic failure to protect students. The school board members looked uncomfortable through all the testimony, shifting in their seats and avoiding eye contact with us. After 2 hours of parents speaking, they moved into their voting session. They voted to implement new policies including mandatory reporting of all physical assaults to police, regardless of family circumstances. They voted for immediate suspension pending investigation for any threats of violence. Most importantly, they voted to remove any consideration of family donations from disciplinary decisions, putting it in writing that money couldn't buy safety exceptions anymore. The policies passed with only one dissenting vote from a board member who'd received campaign contributions from the bully's father. It wasn't enough to undo the damage to our children, but it was something real that might protect future students from going through what our kids went through. The prosecutor called us the following week to tell us the trial date was set for 2 months out. He walked us through what to expect and assured us the evidence was overwhelming. He said they expected either a guilty plea once the bully's attorney saw how strong the case was, or a conviction if it went to trial. The best news was that my son wouldn't have to testify in person because of his age, and because the video-recorded interviews were admissible in juvenile court. I felt relief wash over me at that, because I didn't want my son to have to face his attacker again, didn't want him sitting in a courtroom while the bully stared at him. The prosecutor explained that the girlfriend also wouldn't need to testify in person for the same reasons. He said the physical evidence was strong enough, between the broken window, the gun, the threatening texts and notes, and the injuries on both the bully and our son. My wife asked what kind of sentence the bully might face if convicted, and the prosecutor said juvenile detention until age 18 was likely, possibly longer, depending on the judge's decision. My son slowly began reconnecting with his nunchuck practice, but everything about it was different now. He approached the practice sessions more seriously, without the exuberant play that used to define his training. He focused on control and precision, working through forms with intense concentration instead of the joy he used to show. I watched him practice in the garage one afternoon and realized he understood the true weight of the skill he possessed now. His training had transformed from something fun into something heavy with responsibility. The nunchucks weren't toys anymore in his mind. They were tools that had hurt someone, even though that someone had been trying to hurt him and his girlfriend. I mourned the loss of that innocent enthusiasm, even as I felt proud of his dedication. He was still my son who loved nunchucks, but the incident had aged him in ways a 10-year-old shouldn't have to experience. He practiced with the seriousness of someone who'd used his skills in a real fight and won, but paid a price for that victory in his own peace of mind. The girlfriend's therapy sessions showed real progress over the following weeks. Her therapist worked with her on breathing exercises for when she felt scared, and she practiced them at the school whenever she saw older boys in the hallways. She started raising her hand more in class and eating lunch without checking over her shoulder every few seconds. But some days she'd freeze up when a tall teenager walked past, her whole body going rigid until my son squeezed her hand and reminded her she was safe. Both kids learned grounding techniques where they'd name 5 things they could see, 4 things they could touch, 3 things they could hear. They'd do this together during recess when one of them started feeling anxious, sitting on the bench and going through the list until their breathing slowed down. Their bond grew deeper through all this shared healing, but it carried a weight that 10-year-olds shouldn't have to carry. They understood each other's triggers and fears in ways that made them seem older than their classmates, like they'd lived through something that aged them beyond their years. 2 months after the home invasion, the prosecutor called to tell us the bully's attorney wanted to discuss a plea deal. The lawyer was offering to have his client plead guilty to reduced charges in exchange for treatment-focused sentencing at a juvenile facility instead of regular detention. The prosecutor explained that this would guarantee the bully got mental health care while still being locked up and away from our children. He asked what we thought before responding to the offer. My wife and I talked about it that night after the kids went to bed. We agreed that making sure the bully stayed away from our son and his girlfriend mattered more than pushing for maximum punishment. If he got help for whatever was wrong in his head, maybe he wouldn't hurt someone else's kid down the road. We called the prosecutor back the next morning and told him we'd accept the plea deal as long as the bully served real time in a secure facility and couldn't come anywhere near our children ever again. The plea hearing happened 3 weeks later at the courthouse downtown. My wife and I sat in the courtroom while the bully stood before the judge in an orange jumpsuit, his parents seated behind him looking smaller than I remembered. The judge asked if he understood the charges against him and if he was pleading guilty of his own free will. The bully's voice came out barely louder than a whisper as he read from a paper his lawyer had prepared, admitting guilt to home invasion, assault with a deadly weapon, and stalking. His words sounded flat and rehearsed, like he was reading a book report instead of confessing to breaking into our house with a gun. The judge asked him several questions to make sure he understood what he was admitting to, and each time the bully gave short yes or no answers without looking up from his paper. When the judge asked if he understood that his actions could have killed 2 children, the bully nodded, but didn't say anything that suggested he actually grasped the weight of what he'd done. The judge accepted the plea deal and sentenced him to a minimum of 2 years at a secure juvenile treatment facility with mandatory psychiatric care. She also issued a permanent restraining order that would protect both my son and his girlfriend, stating clearly that the bully could never contact them or come within 500 feet of them for the rest of his life. The whole hearing lasted less than an hour, and then it was over. That evening, my son asked me if the bully had said he was sorry during the hearing. I had to tell him the truth, that the boy only read what his lawyer wrote for him and never actually apologized or showed that he understood why what he did was so wrong. My son's face fell when I explained this, and he asked why someone who hurt people wouldn't say sorry afterward. I didn't have a good answer for that, so I just told him that sometimes people who hurt us don't change or apologize the way we need them to. His therapist spent their next session helping him work through this disappointment, explaining that we can't control whether other people feel sorry or not, but we can decide to find our own peace anyway. She told him that the bully going to a place where he'd get help was a kind of accountability, even without an apology, and that my son had done everything right by protecting himself and his girlfriend. My son seemed to accept this explanation, though I could tell part of him still wished for an apology that would never come. 3 months after the home invasion, our family settled into what the therapist called a new normal. We kept going to therapy every week, and my son worked through his feelings about the incident with someone trained to help kids process trauma. We installed a proper alarm system with sensors on every window and door, and we taught both kids how to use it so they'd feel safer at home. The Nunchucks stayed in the garage, but my son's relationship with them had completely changed. He practiced with them a few times a week now instead of every day, treating them like serious tools instead of toys he played with for fun. He focused on control and precision during his training, working through forms with intense concentration. We all became more careful about locking doors and checking windows before bed, and we didn't leave the kids home alone anymore, even for quick trips to the store. My wife started carrying pepper spray in her purse, and I made sure my phone was always charged in case we needed to call for help. We were more cautious and less trusting than we'd been before that Friday, always aware that danger could come when we least expected it. But we were also closer as a family, checking in with each other more often and making sure everyone felt safe and supported. The school year finally ended in early June, and both kids made it through despite everything they'd been through. Their teachers had given them extra time on assignments when they needed it, and the school counselor checked in with them regularly to make sure they were managing okay. My son's grades stayed steady, mostly B's with a few A's in subjects he really liked. His girlfriend did well too, keeping up with her classwork even on days when her anxiety made it hard to focus. On my son's birthday in late May, his girlfriend gave him a wrapped present during their lunch period at the school. He opened it to find a new set of practice nunchucks, foam ones designed for training that wouldn't hurt anyone if he accidentally hit himself during practice. She told him she picked them out herself at the martial arts store with her dad and that she still thought he was the bravest person she knew. My son hugged her right there in the cafeteria, not caring that other kids were watching, and he carried those foam nunchucks with him for the rest of the school day. Summer vacation brought relief from the constant stress of school schedules, and the worry about the kids being in the building where the bully used to go. We focused on normal family activities that helped my son feel like a regular kid again. He spent hours in our backyard pool, diving for toys and practicing holding his breath underwater. He played video games with his friends online, laughing and shouting into his headset about strategies and winning streaks. He practiced with his nunchucks in the garage a few times a week, slowly getting back some of the joy he used to feel during training. We still went to therapy every Tuesday afternoon, but the sessions felt less heavy than they had in the beginning. My son talked more easily about what happened now, and he didn't cry as often when discussing the home invasion. He started making plans for 5th grade, talking about joining the school's game club, and maybe trying out for the talent show with a nunchuck demonstration. These small pieces of normal childhood were coming back bit by bit, filling in the spaces that fear and trauma had taken over. The girlfriend's family joined us for a camping trip in July at a state park 2 hours from home. We set up tents next to each other and spent the weekend hiking, swimming in the lake and cooking over the campfire. Watching my son and his girlfriend roast marshmallows together reminded me that they were still just kids trying to be kids, even after everything they'd survived. They competed to see who could make the most perfectly golden marshmallow without burning it, laughing when the treats caught fire and had to be blown out. That night, we all sat around the fire telling silly stories, and the two of them held hands while looking up at the stars scattered across the black sky. They made plans for 5th grade, talking about classes they hoped to have together and field trips they were excited about. Their resilience showed through in these moments of normal kid happiness, but my wife and I stayed alert the whole trip, scanning the campground for potential dangers and keeping the kids within sight at all times. We couldn't fully relax anymore, couldn't let our guard down the way we used to, before we learned how quickly safety could shatter. 4 months after the home invasion, my son told his therapist that he wasn't having nightmares as often anymore. He used to wake up screaming 3 or 4 times a week, but now it was down to maybe once every 2 weeks. He said he was starting to feel safe again at home, especially with the new alarm system that beeped whenever a door or window opened. He still checked all the windows before bed every night, walking through the house to make sure they were locked, and he still refused to use the bathroom where the break-in happened. We'd started calling it the guest bathroom, and my son used the one upstairs near his bedroom instead. But he was sleeping through most nights now without waking up in a panic, and his general anxiety had gone down enough that he didn't need to do his grounding exercises as often at the school. The therapist said this was excellent progress and showed that his brain was processing the trauma in healthy ways. She reminded us that healing wasn't a straight line, that he might have setbacks sometimes, but overall he was doing remarkably well for a child who'd been through what he experienced. We received an official notification in the mail that the bully had been formally admitted to the juvenile treatment facility in late August. The letter explained that he'd begun intensive therapy for his behavioral and mental health issues, and that he'd be evaluated regularly to track his progress. The restraining order remained in full effect and would follow him even after his eventual release, meaning he could never legally come near our children again. If he violated the order at any point, he'd face immediate arrest and additional charges. The facility was 3 hours away in a different county, far enough that we'd never accidentally run into him or his family around town. Reading that letter brought a sense of closure, knowing he was locked up and getting help while our kids continued healing at home. My wife folded the notification and filed it away with all the other legal documents from the case, and we didn't mention it to my son because we didn't want to disrupt the progress he was making by reminding him of the bully's existence. 5 months after the home invasion, my son walked into the kitchen holding a flyer about middle school preparation classes. He wanted to sign up for the summer program that would help him get ready for 6th grade. I read through the information and saw they offered tours of the middle school building, practice with locker combinations, and meetings with teachers. My son pointed to a section about after-school clubs and tapped his finger on the martial arts club description. He said he wanted to join when he got to 6th grade next year, his voice excited in a way I hadn't heard in months. I told him that sounded perfect and filled out the registration form that same afternoon. Over the next few weeks, he attended the prep classes twice a week and came home each time talking about the middle school and what 6th grade would be like. His girlfriend signed up for the same program, and they walked through the hallways together during the building tours, holding hands and pointing out classrooms they hoped to share. One evening after class, my son told me about how his girlfriend had gotten nervous during a fire drill practice, and he'd helped her through it by reminding her to use her breathing exercises. She'd calmed down and thanked him afterward, and I could see how their relationship had grown beyond just being boyfriend and girlfriend into something deeper, where they really understood each other's needs. They knew each other's triggers now and could offer the right kind of comfort when one of them struggled with anxiety or memories of what happened. The school district's legal team reached out to our attorney in early June with a settlement offer. They wanted to resolve everything out of court and avoid a public trial that would expose their failures in detail. Our attorney reviewed their proposal and called us to discuss the terms. The district agreed to fund comprehensive safety training for all staff members across every school in the district. They would implement the new anti-bullying policies we'd pushed for at the school board meeting, making them standard procedure district-wide instead of just at our son's school. They also committed to establishing a full-time victim advocacy position, a dedicated person whose only job would be ensuring that future complaints got handled appropriately and that no student safety concerns got ignored because of money or politics. The settlement included a financial component, but our attorney explained that the real value was in forcing systemic change that might prevent another family from experiencing what we went through. My wife and I talked about it that night after the kids were asleep. We agreed that holding the district accountable mattered more than dragging them through a trial. The policies they were implementing could actually protect other children, and that felt more important than any monetary compensation. We accepted the settlement the next day. 6 months after the home invasion, a local martial arts studio invited my son to perform a nunchuck demonstration at their open house event. The studio owner had heard about what happened from other parents in the community and wanted to give my son a chance to showcase his skills in a positive setting. My son practiced for 2 weeks leading up to the event, working on a routine that displayed his precision and control. The day of the open house, about 50 people gathered in the studio to watch various demonstrations. When my son's turn came, he stepped onto the mat wearing his regular clothes and holding his transformer nunchucks. He moved through his routine with perfect form, each strike and spin executed with the kind of control that only comes from thousands of hours of practice. The nunchucks whistled through the air as he performed complex patterns, his movements smooth and confident. When he finished, the crowd clapped loudly, and several parents approached me afterward. A woman asked if my son gave lessons because her 12-year-old wanted to learn. A father wanted to know what age kids could start training. Another parent asked about the best type of nunchucks for beginners. I found myself explaining to each of them that discipline and control matter more than flashy moves. I told them the real skill isn't in how fast you can spin the nunchucks or how many tricks you can do. The real skill is knowing when not to use what you've learned, understanding that the ability to defend yourself works best when you never have to prove it. The girlfriend's parents hosted a celebration dinner at their house 2 weeks later, marking 6 months of healing and growth for both children. They invited our whole family over on a Saturday evening and we brought dessert. The girlfriend's mom had cooked a big meal with all the kids' favorite foods, and we sat around their dining room table sharing stories and laughing. The girlfriend's dad made a toast, thanking us for everything our son had done to protect their daughter, his voice getting emotional as he talked about how different things could have ended that day. My wife squeezed my hand under the table, and I saw tears in her eyes, even though she was smiling. After dinner, the kids asked to play board games in the living room, and we let them while the adults cleaned up the kitchen. I watched them through the doorway as they set up the game, their movements easy and relaxed. The girlfriend laughed at something my son said, and he grinned back at her. They argued playfully about the rules and took turns rolling the dice. There was a lightness to them that had been missing for months, a return to normal kid behavior that didn't carry the weight of trauma in every interaction. The home invasion and everything that led up to it had become part of their story, but it wasn't the whole story anymore. They were just 2 kids who liked each other, playing games and being silly on a Saturday night. My son's therapist called me the following week to discuss his progress. She said he'd made significant improvements in how he processed the trauma and managed his anxiety. His nightmares had decreased to maybe once or twice a month, instead of multiple times per week. He was using his coping strategies effectively when he felt triggered. He could talk about what happened without shutting down or getting overwhelmed. The therapist recommended transitioning to monthly check-ins rather than weekly sessions, noting that he'd developed healthy ways to handle his emotions and had worked through the trauma in age-appropriate ways. She emphasized that we should continue therapy as long as he needed it, but the reduction in frequency felt like a milestone worth celebrating. It meant he was healing, that the work we'd all been doing to help him process everything was actually working. My wife and I took him out for ice cream that evening to mark the occasion. We didn't make a big deal about why, just told him we were proud of how hard he'd been working in therapy. He ate his chocolate ice cream and told us about a funny thing that happened at the school, his face relaxed and happy. A school board member from a neighboring district contacted me in July, asking if I'd be willing to speak at their upcoming meeting about bullying policies. She'd heard about our case through the regional education network and thought our experience could help them strengthen their own procedures. I agreed immediately, seeing it as a chance to potentially protect other children from similar situations. The meeting took place on a Tuesday evening in a packed auditorium. I sat with several other parents who'd also dealt with inadequate school responses to bullying, and we each took turns sharing our stories. When my turn came, I walked to the microphone and explained everything that had happened. I described the initial assault on my son's girlfriend, the photos her parents had provided to the school, and the one-day suspension that did nothing to stop the escalation. I talked about the threats, the stalking, and how it all culminated in a home invasion where my 10-year-old son had to fight an armed intruder to protect his girlfriend's life. The room was completely silent as I spoke. Several board members looked uncomfortable, but they listened to every word. After the presentations, the board voted to review and strengthen their bullying policies. Other parents approached me in the parking lot afterward, thanking me for speaking up and sharing contact information so we could continue advocating together. I realized that sharing our experience might actually help protect other children, that something good could come from the worst thing my family had ever been through. My son came to me a few weeks later with a flyer for a martial arts tournament happening in August. He wanted to enter the Nunchuck skills competition, explaining that he wanted to demonstrate his abilities in a positive context rather than having violence be the only story associated with his training. I talked it over with my wife, and we both supported his decision. He practiced his competition routine every day, refining each movement until it was perfect. The tournament took place at a large sports complex with multiple competition rings set up. We registered him in the youth division for traditional weapons forms. When his turn came, he stepped into the ring wearing a borrowed martial arts uniform. The judges sat at a table with clipboards, ready to score his performance. My son bowed to them, then began his routine. He moved through the forms with precision and control, his nunchucks flowing through complex patterns without a single mistake. Every strike landed exactly where it should. Every spin was perfectly timed. When he finished and bowed again, the judges marked their scores. He earned second place out of 15 competitors, losing first only to a 13-year-old who'd been training in a formal studio for 6 years. My son accepted his silver medal with a huge smile, genuine pride showing on his face. This was an accomplishment that had nothing to do with the home invasion, a recognition of his skill that came from competition rather than survival. 8 months after the incident, we finally scheduled the bathroom remodel. The broken window had been temporarily fixed, but we'd never updated the whole space. My son still refused to use that bathroom, walking upstairs to the one near his bedroom instead every single time. We hired a contractor who replaced the window with security glass that couldn't be easily broken. They updated the fixtures, painted the walls a different color, and installed better lighting. The whole project took 3 days. When it was finished, the bathroom looked completely different from how it had been the night the bully climbed through the window. That evening after the contractor left, my son stood in the hallway staring at the bathroom door. My wife and I watched from the kitchen, not pushing him, but staying nearby in case he needed support. He took a deep breath, walked to the door and opened it. He stepped inside and looked around at the new space. He used the bathroom for the first time since the invasion, washing his hands afterward at the new sink. When he came out, he nodded at us without saying anything, but I could see the relief on his face. It was a small victory, but it represented his ongoing healing and his ability to reclaim spaces that trauma had taken from him. The girlfriend's family made their final decision about moving in September. They'd been considering relocating to a different neighborhood or even a different district, worried about their daughter's safety and whether she could truly heal while living, so close to where everything had happened. But they decided to stay permanently after seeing how much community support they'd found through this experience. Their daughter was thriving with continued therapy and the security of having her boyfriend nearby. The two kids had built something strong together, a friendship and relationship that had survived the worst and emerged even stronger. One afternoon, when both kids were at our house, I overheard them making plans for high school together, even though that was years in the future. The girlfriend said she wanted to try out for the soccer team. My son said he'd come to all her games. They talked about classes they might take together and what clubs they wanted to join. Their voices were excited and hopeful, full of normal teenage dreams that had nothing to do with trauma or violence. My son came into the living room one evening while I was watching TV. He sat down next to me on the couch and was quiet for a minute before speaking. He said he was glad he learned nunchucks because it meant he could protect someone he loves when she really needed him. But he also said he hopes he never has to use them that way again, that he doesn't want to hurt anyone else even if they deserve it. I turned off the TV and looked at him. I told him that's the mark of a true protector, having the ability to defend yourself and others, but preferring peace whenever possible. I said I was proud of his skill with the nunchucks and how much discipline he'd developed through all those hours of practice. But I was even more proud of his heart, of the fact that he understood the weight of what he'd done and didn't take any pride in having hurt someone. He leaned against my shoulder, and we sat there together in the quiet living room, both of us thinking about how much had changed in 8 months, and how much growing he'd done through something no 10-year-old should ever have to experience. The next week, we started something new at our house. The first Saturday of every month became our family safety meeting. We'd sit at the kitchen table and go through our security checklist together. My son would test the new alarm system, check all the window locks, and make sure the motion sensor lights still worked in the backyard. My wife reviewed our emergency contact list and made sure everyone's phone had the updated numbers. I walked the perimeter outside looking for anything that seemed off or different. But the meetings weren't just about locks and alarms. We talked openly about any worries or fears anyone had. My son would bring up things that bothered him at the school or in the neighborhood. We listened without judgment and worked through solutions together. His input mattered as much as ours, because he'd proven he could handle serious situations and make smart decisions under pressure. These monthly check-ins became something we all looked forward to, a way to stay connected and aware without letting fear control our daily lives. 10 months after that Friday night when the bathroom window shattered, both kids were doing better than anyone expected. My son's therapy appointments dropped to once a month, and his girlfriend's family reported similar progress with her treatment. At the school, they'd both made solid friend groups who knew about what happened, but didn't define them by it. Other students looked up to them for their kindness and their willingness to speak up when they saw bullying happening. They'd become advocates without even trying, just by being themselves and refusing to let their trauma make them bitter or afraid. Teachers told us they'd started a buddy system at recess, where older kids looked out for younger ones who seemed lonely or picked on. My son and his girlfriend led by example, showing other students that standing up for someone doesn't always mean fighting. It means being present and making sure nobody feels alone. The school counselor said they'd created a ripple effect of positive change throughout the whole student body. One afternoon, a thick envelope arrived from the court system with official stamps and legal seals all over it. Inside was the required 6-month progress report from the juvenile treatment facility where the bully was being held. The report indicated he was attending all his therapy sessions and participating in group activities. His counselors noted some improvement in his ability to recognize how his actions affected other people, though they cautioned that real change takes years, not months. The restraining order remained active and would follow him even after his release. We had zero interest in any contact with him or his family, but knowing he was getting professional help provided a small measure of closure. That chapter of our lives was sealed shut, and we could focus completely on moving forward without looking back over our shoulders. A year after that terrifying night when our son stood in the hallway with his transformer nunchucks facing down an armed intruder, life looked different in every way. My son still practiced in the garage, but with a new understanding of what his skills really meant. He moved through his forms with precision and control, no longer treating the nunchucks like toys, but respecting them as tools that carried serious responsibility. His girlfriend came over most weekends and sometimes sat on the workbench watching him practice. They'd talk between sets about normal kid stuff like the new video game coming out next month or the science project they were partnering on for school. Their relationship had survived something that would have broken most adults, and it came out stronger and more real than before. They understood each other in ways that went deeper than words, a bond forged through shared trauma and mutual protection. We'd all changed from what happened that Friday. My wife and I were more cautious and aware, checking locks twice and paying attention to our surroundings in ways we never did before. But we'd also discovered strength we didn't know our family possessed. The 4 of us had faced the worst and came through it together, building a bond that felt unbreakable. My son had learned he could protect the people he loved when it mattered most, and that knowledge sat in him quietly, not as pride, but as simple fact. We carried our awareness and our caution forward into each new day, but we also carried our strength and our certainty that we could handle whatever came next. Well, that's another perfectly average ending. If you're still here, congratulations on your questionable taste. Go ahead and subscribe. We've both committed now.